Welcome to the Fantasy NASCAR podcast, the Sunday show, the Cookout Southern 500 at Darlington. Before we get into the driver picks, we need to talk about the practice data, which you can access at raceflipprice.com, Venmo, PayPal, Cash App, $30 for the month of September. I'll go ahead and throw in Darlington while we're at it if you don't. And if you're using the spreadsheet and look at the practice data, you'll notice, as always, Group A is faster, but there's a weird thing with the stats because of the Ricky Stenhouse spin at the 5-minute, 30-second mark. Group A on a clean track is always faster, and we see that in the 1 and 5 lap averages, but Stenhouse spins, and those drivers are unable to run 10, 15 laps in Group A. So you'll see Group A is faster, but then strangely enough, Group B tends to be faster on the long run, on a slower track, but that's because they were able to run an uninterrupted 10, 15, 20 lap run. So you really have to separate the data on your own. And I've got an A sheet and a B sheet in the spreadsheet so you can see, so that you're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges. So understand that. I hope that helps you. Another interesting thing that I also want to point out before we go over some of the drivers is just some of the trends with your hog points or dominator points. You look and see who scored the most points in the spring race. Only 2.25 hog points. That was Barry coming from the back. But what's really interesting is you'll see that the driver that gets the most hog or dominator points isn't always the top scorer. So we know Reddick had his issue in the spring, but being that it's such a volatile race, you look at last fall, 65 points, only the 5th highest score. 11th most fantasy points from the driver who led the most laps. 11th most. It's Darlington, baby. And that's what happens. So just something to be aware of, that the volatility of this race. You might like Larson a lot, but as we've seen with Larson, he did win the Southern 500 last season. But we have seen him get a little too aggressive. We've seen other drivers get too aggressive, especially in a 500-mile race at Darlington. A lot can go wrong, and you can clearly see that. It doesn't mean you're going to fade hog points. It may just mean that you may want to spread out your ownership at the top when you're trying to predict who's going to lead the most laps or run the most fast laps. The last thing that I will talk about before we go over some of these drivers is I wouldn't fall too in love with practice data or even what drivers have done recently, or even what drivers have done at Darlington in the past. Maybe so much Darlington in the past I would lean on. I guess I would downgrade practice data just a little bit, because this is a long race and there's going to be many adjustments. And even in the spring race, we saw that SHR Fords weren't really the greatest in practice, but had pretty good race cars. You look at Rick Ware's cars, they found the right setup change. Other guys were unable to find the setup change. And so if you're just looking at practice and saying, oh, they're fast in practice, and that's just one set of tires on one run, maybe, you can take that and say, well, this team's closer to figuring it out. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the team that figures it out mid-race is going to be the ones that, finish up at the top, lead the most laps. And the only way to really be able to predict that is just looking at previous results at possibly Darlington or other races where teams have made good in-race adjustments. So the guys that were fast on Saturday, there's just no guarantee that they're going to continue to be fast. Track's going to change. Darlington changes more than anywhere else. And adjustments are going to be made. Again, the SHR Fords were able to stick with it and find the right adjustments in the spring. Rick Ware was able to make the right adjustments. So it wouldn't surprise me to see guys that weren't fast in practice that make the right adjustments that move through the field. That being said, we also can recall from the previous podcast this week, talking about how the top 5 pretty much was pretty static. 5 to 10 was pretty static. Not a lot of movement, not a lot of passing. It is Darlington. So track position is definitely going to matter for those dominators up front. And if we look at the hog trends, see at Darlington, you get your pole setter typically scoring 43 hog or fast lap led dominator points. They're coming from the front for the most part, if you want to try to hone in on that. Again, you look at the RFK Fords, not the fastest in practice in the past, not the fastest in practice this time. And you could go into this race saying, oh, well, RFK Fords don't have as much speed as Larson or Blaney or Tyler Reddick. But that doesn't mean they're not going to find that speed. They found the speed last time. Now, do they quite have the track position as they did last time? Not quite. But again, in-race adjustments can happen. So let's look at some of the drivers and talk about where they might finish. So Stenhouse liked this car for the couple laps that he got to run before he kissed the wall, and have no problem playing Stenhouse at 6,200, starting 36th. He can easily get to 20th place, no fault there. Gralla had a really good car in the spring race. They made the right adjustments. He definitely earned his finish in the 18th place finish. Now, again, there was a good bit of attrition that allowed for boosts, teams making mistakes, but I don't see why that wouldn't happen again in a longer race. I'm not interested in SVG. Gillen, routinely a top 15 driver. You got to pay a little bit more for him than Stenhouse. I don't know if he offers as much. I think ultimately, yeah, his car's probably a little bit better. And I guess he has a little bit better reputation than Stenhouse. I don't think you can go wrong either direction. Not really that interested in Daniel Suarez, Michael McDowell. You know, if we are looking at practice, he didn't really show a lot. I would much rather go to his teammate Todd Gilly or Stenhouse starting further back and also cheaper. Priest is interesting. As I mentioned before, the SHR Fords were pretty good in the spring. He was the worst of them. He wasn't awful. He gives you a little bit more savings. Typically, I'm wiping him off the board, but starting 30th, that's fine by me. Gregson, you know that he's tore this track up in the Xfinity Series, had a pretty good car in the spring race. Not the best of the SHR Fords, but he was competitive. Wasn't fast in practice last time around. Didn't qualify well last time around. Here we are again. I don't doubt that he can move forward. He's going to cost you a little bit more. But of the drivers that we've mentioned so far, I think he is probably the best and the fastest, and will be able to get closer to the front than any of the other ones. Jones is kind of interesting in that the spring race was his first race back from injury. This is a track that he really loves and has raced well at. Obviously, Legacy won at this track with him. They worked and weren't able to make the right adjustments in the spring race, just couldn't find the speed. He still was able to salvage, a top 20 in that race without really nailing it. I mean, I think if you are picking Jones, and I think a lot of people don't really want to, because you've got the Gregson play seems better, and you got some cheaper guys starting even further back. But Jones starting 28th is appealing, but he's got to do a little bit better than that 20th place finish, which means they've got to find the right adjustments. They did not find those adjustments in the spring, but they could, and they can. And if they can get the car dialed in a little bit, you know he is capable of making it even better and getting into 15th place and almost matching the same upside as a Noah Gragson. And I would believe that he'll probably go even lower owned. I think it's just a pick of, can this team make the adjustment? Can they dial it in the 500 laps? Bowman would be the much popular option. Top 10 in the spring race. Probably had top 15 cars, what he admitted. But he got through the race. He didn't wreck. He got the attrition boost. And he just had a clean day. It's pretty much what he's done this season, is just have clean days. And so we think that Gregson and Jones could get 15s. Amongst this group, the most likely to get a top 15 would be Alex Bowman. It's going to cost you a smidge more, but you feel very much more comfortable. And I have no problem so far with, taking Bowman, Jones, Gregson, putting 2 or maybe 3 in a line. I don't think you're going to get 3 at that price. And then the guys I've mentioned before, Gilly and Stenhouse, stand out to me at the back. You can get real cute with Gralla because you absolutely need the savings. I don't mind. Not interested in Zane, Daniel, or Burton, although Burton showed a little bit more speed than we have seen recently. But he's just starting too close to the front compared to the better value plays back there. Logano is a fine option. 8,700, slides in pretty well. When we look at these trends of some of the most fantasy points in this race, again, I point out that a couple of these guys are going to be place differential guys. And so that place differential guy would be a Joey Logano, scoring the most fantasy points, but not really getting a lot of fast laps led. getting some, siphoning off some while just running up front. This could be a Joey Logano spot right there. Again, I don't want to overreact to what you see in practice. Just trust that you like the driver. Same thing with Ross Chastain. Again, you're going to want to look at Group A versus Group B practice data. And Chastain, if you really want, at least they showed some speed on the laps they ran. Looks like the team is kind of regrouping from kind of a stale season. Haley's starting too close to the front for me, but again, he did have a really good spring race. Chase Elliott is fine as well. If you're trying to chase place differential, I would not put him in the category of a guy who's going to lead laps and run fast laps. Once you've got your hogs plugged in, if you can afford a Chase Elliott, that's fine. But Ross is much cheaper. Joey is much cheaper. And I don't think I would elevate Elliott too much above them if we are really looking at working through. And if they do make their way forward, as I mentioned, the top 5 was pretty static. It's going to be very hard for him to get up into the top 5. I could see him knocking on the door of the top 10. He was just okay in the spring. Logano had a top 10 car in the spring until I had that penalty in the last caution. All 3 drivers, I think, could be top 10s. And I think their price reflects the probability as well. Joy too close to the front. Nemechek too close to the front. Same with Kyle Busch. Austin Dillon's interesting. He did have a good practice. You want to overreact to practice? Then this is your guy. It looked like when you compare the data and try to separate things that he could quite possibly have the edge of a top 10 car. If he could move forward, maintain his track position, not make any mistakes, then, he's actually going to work. No one's going to really want to go to this play because we've got value in the back that has huge place differential upside, a lot less lower of a floor, but I would keep him alive. You could probably say the same for Josh Berry. He's going to cost you a little bit more. Again, if you overreact to practice, you don't really like what you see, but then you have to dial it back and say, guess what? He drove through the field in the spring race with ease almost, and he didn't really have a lot of speed in that practice. So it looks like him and Childers are pretty dialed in at this track, and I wouldn't rule him out, although he comes at a little bit hefty of a price tag, and I think the safer plays are just to chase the guys in the back, the Gregson, the Bowman, the Jones. We go up to Hamlin. Hamlin had a top 10 car in the spring. He's close enough to move forward. He's pretty much starting in a very similar position, but he could just simply get locked out of the top 5, so I'm not really that interested. And if it's just a place differential play with the scrapings of fast laps and laps led, he's just too expensive. I'd rather take the place differential and the siphoned off fast laps with Gibbs. Will RFK get it dialed in again? It's up to you. Do you think they're going to hit the setup right? They hit the setup right in the spring, but I'm just not that interested. And one of the benefits for Brad Keselowski and Ty Gibbs in the spring, they have better starting position. They're not just going to walk up through the top 10. We saw that in the spring race. We've seen that in sprint races before. Unless you really get this car dialed in, you can be fast. There's nowhere for you to go. I don't really love Bell at this track. William Byron has been phenomenal at Darlington in the past. One of the highest rated drivers just below Denny Hamlin. He is close enough he can make some moves. He would be on the short list of possible lap leaders. Ryan Blaney, probably the fastest in his practice session. Looked pretty good, but he has struggled at this racetrack in the past. I believe he doesn't have a top 5 finish at Darlington ever. It's just not been one of his places, but he has improved at basically every track. We used to say that for several tracks for Blaney. I think he's in the conversation. Reddick continuing to show tons of speed. This is a track that suits him. No problem jamming that in. I would probably elevate him to number 1 status. Truex just below him. Larson sandwiched in between as a lap leader. Again, these are guys that can win this race, but they just need them to finish this race. And we've seen Larson, we've seen Truex, we've seen Reddick just not finish this race. We've seen Blaney not finish this race. It's Darlington, baby. Can't believe in Chase Briscoe. Don't believe in Hocever. With Bubba, what you're hoping is he leads a good bit of the first session and then just does not completely fall off. Finishes the race. If he gets you a 7th place finish and leads at the beginning, then he's going to be optimal at 7,700. As long as he doesn't get passed early. And I don't see Hocever and Briscoe as too big of a threat. Larson, though, Reddick, they are. And how quickly they take the lead away from him could determine that. And then Bubba also has to finish the 500 miles. There it is. There's my run through. Hopefully it helps you out. Like, subscribe, share. $30 for September. I'll throw in Darlington.